One might have thought that the Republican Party, having spent decades cultivating the pretense of moral superiority and traditional values, would at least attempt to maintain the facade when its younger adherents gathered in private. How charmingly naive. The recent exposure of the Young Republican National Federation's group chat reveals not merely the casual bigotry one might expect from political novices, but rather a grotesque carnival of hatred indistinguishable from the rhetoric of organized white supremacy. These are not the awkward mumblings of the politically incorrect. This is the id of modern conservatism laid bare, writhing in its own filth. The litany of depravity reads like a fascist fever dream. "I love Hitler," proclaimed Peter Giunta, the former chair of New York State Young Republicans, with the casual enthusiasm one might reserve for a favorite sports team. His colleagues responded not with horror but with embellishments, suggestions for gas chambers, jokes about sending political opponents to their deaths, proposals for physiological torture methods. The N-word appeared with the frequency of punctuation marks. References to Black Americans as monkeys and watermelon people flowed as naturally as political talking points. When discussion turned to women, rape became epic, a source of amusement rather than revulsion. And through it all, sitting among them like a serpent in the garden, was Vermont State Senator Samuel Douglas, contributing his own special brand of racism about Indian women who just didn't bathe often, while his wife Brianna chimed in with anti-Semitic musings about expecting the Jew to be honest. This is your Republican youth movement, ladies and gentlemen, the supposed future of American conservatism, the young lions being groomed for power. These are not teenage miscreants experimenting with shock value in their parents' basement. These are political operatives in their 20s and 30s, chiefs of staff to elected officials, state party leaders, individuals with real power and influence. They knew precisely what they were doing. "If we ever had a leak of this chat, we would be cooked. FR, wrote Bobby Walker, the new chair of the New York State Young Republicans, displaying a self-awareness that makes the entire enterprise even more damning. But the true revelation, the moment when the mask doesn't merely slip but is torn away entirely, comes in the response from Vice President J.D. Vance. Here we have the second highest official in the land, confronted with hundreds of messages praising Hitler and advocating genocide, and what does he offer? Not condemnation, not horror, not even the performative outrage one might expect from a politician caught in an uncomfortable position. No, Vance looks at this cesspool of hatred and sees boys being boys. "Kids do stupid things," Vance mused on the Charlie Kirk show, as if discussing toilet papering a neighbor's house rather than fantasizing about gas chambers. "Especially young boys, they tell edgy, offensive jokes, like that's what kids do." One must pause to appreciate the breathtaking audacity of calling 30-something political operatives kids and reducing Hitler worship to edgy jokes. This is moral bankruptcy dressed up as folksy wisdom, the kind of reasoning that would excuse a lynching as a prank gone wrong. Vance's defense becomes even more contemptible when one considers his own biography. This is a man who built his political career on a memoir about the dysfunction of white working-class America, who positioned himself as someone who escaped that world's worst impulses through education and enlightenment. Yet when confronted with the educated elite of his own party spewing the vilest racism imaginable, including slurs against Indian women like his own wife Usha, he suddenly discovers a wellspring of understanding. "I really don't want us to grow up in a country where a kid telling a very offensive stupid joke is cause to ruin their lives," he pleaded, as if the real tragedy here is that bigots might face consequences rather than that such bigotry has infected the Republican Party's bloodstream. The contrast with Vance's treatment of other speech is illuminating. This is the same man who, just weeks ago, demanded that anyone who celebrated Charlie Kirk's death should lose their jobs, declaring that people should not be protected from being fired for being a disgusting person. The same man who has called for the prosecution of pro-Palestinian protesters, many of them actual college students younger than these young Republicans. But when it comes to his own tribe's Hitler worship and rape jokes, suddenly we're all being too sensitive, engaging in pearl-clutching over mere boyish hijinks. One Republican, Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma, had the minimal decency to break ranks, telling CNN that he would never let my kids joke like that, and invoking his grandfather who went over on Omaha Beach and saw the despicable things that the Nazis did. But Mullin stands nearly alone in his party, a single voice of sanity in a chorus of deflection and excuse-making. The Young Republican National Federation itself called for resignations, but this is mere damage control, the panicked response of an organization caught with its pants down, rather than any genuine reckoning with what they've nurtured. What we're witnessing is the natural culmination of decades of Republican dog whistling finally graduating to wolf howling. The Southern strategy's careful coding has given way to open racism. The polite prejudices of country clubs have morphed into telegram channels celebrating the Third Reich. This is what happens when a political party spends generation after generation winking at bigots, courting extremists, and treating white grievance as its organizing principle. You cannot spend 50 years fertilizing the soil with racial resentment and then act surprised when it blooms into full-blown fascism. The tradition of American conservatism once included figures who, whatever their other faults, would have recoiled in genuine horror at messages celebrating Hitler. Barry Goldwater, for all his problems, was married to a woman of Jewish heritage and would have had no truck with gas chamber jokes. Ronald Reagan, that patron saint of modern Republicans, whatever his racial blind spots, at least maintained the pretense that America stood against the kind of totalitarian evil the Nazis represented. Even the recently departed Dick Cheney, a man who could find a justification for torture, would presumably have drawn the line at "I love Hitler." But that Republican Party is dead, replaced by something far more sinister. The mask has not merely slipped, it has been cast aside with contempt. When the youth wing of your political movement, the people you're grooming for future leadership, casually traffic in genocide jokes and racial slurs, when they speak longingly of gas chambers and torture methods, you don't have a messaging problem or a few bad apples. You have a Nazi problem. And when your party's response is to minimize, deflect, and excuse rather than excise this cancer, you reveal that the problem runs far deeper than a single group chat. The most damning aspect is how unsurprising it all feels. Did anyone really expect different from the party of Trump, the party that has spent the last decade normalizing the abnormal, excusing the inexcusable, defending the indefensible? Trump himself recently posted AI-generated videos depicting Democratic leaders in racist stereotypes, spread lies about Haitian immigrants eating pets, and hosted comedians who mocked Puerto Ricans and black people at his rallies. The young Republicans didn't corrupt themselves in a vacuum. They were following the template their elders provided. Art Gibson, who studies white racial extremism, observed that Trump's persistent use of hostile, often incendiary language that normalizes aggressive discourse in conservative circles can be incredibly influential on young conservatives who are still trying to figure out what is political discourse. But this lets them off too easy. These are not confused children struggling to understand political norms. They are adults who know exactly what they're doing and believe they'll get away with it because historically they always have. The Republican Party now faces a choice, though it's one they've already made by their actions and inactions. They can continue down this path, nurturing the extremists in their ranks, excusing hatred as humor, treating fascism as a legitimate political position deserving of debate rather than destruction. Or they could actually live up to their alleged principles, purge the Nazi sympathizers from their ranks, and attempt to rebuild as something other than a haven for bigots and fascists. That they've chosen the former, that they've rallied around Vance's "boys will be boys" dismissal, rather than expressing genuine horror, tells you everything you need to know about the moral state of American conservatism. Senator Douglas, the only elected official in the chat, eventually resigned, but only after days of pressure, and only while insisting his comments were taken out of context. His resignation statement was a masterpiece of self-pity, focusing on the horrific hate he had received, rather than the horrific hate he had dispensed. Even in disgrace, he couldn't muster a genuine apology or acknowledge the reality of what he'd participated in. This is the Republican way. Deny, deflect, and when finally cornered, portray yourself as the real victim. The future of the Republican Party is not some distant specter. It is here now, typing away in group chats, sharing Hitler memes, and fantasizing about violence against their enemies. These are the people who will run for office, who will staff campaigns, who will write policy, who will shape the conservative movement for decades to come, And the party's leadership, exemplified by Vance, has made it clear that this is acceptable, that this is normal, that this is just kids being kids. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. The young Republicans have shown us exactly who they are, and the party's response has shown us that this is exactly who they want to be. The only question remaining is whether the American electorate will continue to pretend otherwise, or whether they will finally recognize the fascist rot at the heart of modern conservatism and respond accordingly. Given recent history, one shouldn't hold their breath.